January 1943. The outskirts of Voronezh, Russia. The air is frozen stiff, the kind that bites through steel and bone alike. A battered Soviet T-34 rests half-buried in snow, its engine silent, its crew huddled inside like ghosts in a steel coffin. Outside, the world is a blur of gray smoke and distant artillery. Inside the cramped hull, Sergeant Viktor Sokolov, a mechanic drafted from a tractor factory, wipes grease from his trembling hands. He listens to the wind howl through the armor seams. Orders are clear. No modifications, no risks. But the tank's heart, its diesel engine, feels weak, strangled by its own limits. And the enemy? The Panzers are coming, faster, heavier, unrelenting. Sokolov exhales, steady. He reaches for a wrench. One forbidden twist on the governor bolt, a simple act that could court execution. The others watch in silence as he mutters, "If it burns, it burns." Then, with a defiant roar, the T-34 engine erupts. Louder, rawer, alive. And somewhere beyond the snow, the German line is about to meet a new kind of nightmare. By 1943, the Second World War had transformed from a clash of armies into a brutal contest of machines. The vast steppes of the Eastern Front became the proving grounds for mankind's most formidable engines of destruction. Steel beasts that decided life and death in seconds. Germany's Panzers, once the embodiment of precision and speed, now rolled heavier and deadlier than ever. The Tiger I, a towering juggernaut of 57 tons, entered the battlefield with an 88mm cannon capable of piercing almost any Allied armor before they could even reply. Its thick plating made it nearly invulnerable to most Soviet weapons, and its mechanical growl carried a psychological weight all its own. Across the frozen plains, the Soviet Union responded with its own symbol of industrial defiance, the T-34. Designed in 1940 by Mikhail Koshkin and his Kharkiv engineers, it was lean, efficient, and deadly in motion. Sloped armor, wide tracks, and a powerful V2 diesel engine gave it the balance between speed and protection that Germany could not match in numbers. The T-34 was the weapon of the people, mass-produced, rugged, and brutally simple to repair. But as the war dragged into its third winter, the T-34's early brilliance began to fade. German engineers adapted quickly. The newer Panzers IV and V and the mighty Tigers carried thicker armor and long-barreled guns that tore through Soviet tanks at distances beyond a kilometer. What once had been the hunter was becoming the hunted. Behind every tank that burned on the steppe, there was a story, not of generals or grand strategy, but of grease-stained men working through the night. In makeshift workshops carved out of barns or abandoned churches, Soviet mechanics labored with broken tools, scrap metal, and desperation. They patched radiators with tin, welded armor plates from wrecks, and scavenged parts from the dead. Theirs was a war fought not in glory, but in grime. Fuel was scarce. Engines were overworked. Winter air thickened diesel like glue, and batteries froze solid. Many tanks failed to start at all. Yet when orders came to move, the men pushed, cursed, and improvised. Because on the Eastern Front, hesitation meant death. By early 1943, this grinding mechanical war reached its breaking point. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended, but the Red Army's tanks were exhausted. Entire regiments had fewer than half their machines operational. Soviet industry, relocated to the Ural Mountains, produced replacements at staggering rates, but quality suffered under speed. New tanks arrived with flaws, governors set to restrict RPMs to prevent engine failures, and safety measures that prioritized survival of equipment over battlefield performance. To the frontline mechanics, these restrictions felt like shackles. They knew that the V2 engine, a marvel of wartime engineering, could push harder, run hotter, deliver more power if unleashed. but the rules were absolute. Unauthorized modifications were sabotage under Stalin's command, punishable by imprisonment or worse. Still, necessity has a way of bending rules. Men like Viktor Sokolov, trained in factories before the war, understood the heartbeat of these machines better than their commanders did. They knew the subtle rhythm of a well-tuned engine, the difference between safety and survival. And as the German panzers pressed forward with growing ferocity, whispers began to circulate in tank crews that somewhere, someone had found a way to make the T-34 untold 34 run faster, stronger, deadlier. It was no longer just a battle of armor thickness or gun calibers. It had become a battle of wits, mechanic versus engineer, field improvisation versus official doctrine. The Red Army's greatest strength was not in its technology, but in its adaptability. Soviet soldiers were taught to repair under fire, to cannibalize the wrecks of war for survival. They turned scarcity into innovation, and while official manuals banned any modification to engine systems, field conditions often ignored such paper boundaries. In this world of necessity, courage took many forms. Some men stormed bunkers. Others fought their battles beneath the hatches, turning bolts and adjusting fuel lines by touch alone. As spring approached, rumors of a tank that could outrun German panzers began to spread across the front. Commanders dismissed them as exaggerations, stories born of exhaustion and hope. But deep in one frozen workshop near the Don River, a single mechanic was proving otherwise. He had spent weeks studying the limits of his T-34's V2 diesel, testing, listening, risking court-martial for every adjustment. He understood what every engineer back home feared, that in war, limits were a luxury. Soon, the sound of his modified engine would echo across the steppe, breaking not only silence, but doctrine. His name was Viktor Sokolov, a tank mechanic by assignment, a craftsman by nature. Before the war, he had repaired tractors in a small factory outside Yaroslavl, working long nights to keep farm machinery alive through brutal winters. When the war came, his hands, steady, methodical, and stained with oil, became weapons of another kind. The Red Army drafted him not for his marksmanship, but for his skill with a wrench. By 1943, Sokolov was attached to a frontline repair detachment near Voronezh, where tanks limped back from the front lines, shells lodged in their armor, engines coughing black smoke. Every morning, the smell of burned diesel mixed with the metallic sting of frost. He worked knee-deep in snow, scavenging spare parts from the ruins of destroyed vehicles. Each repair was a race against time. For every tank that stood still too long became a target. The T-34, his constant companion, was both miracle and frustration. Its V2 diesel engine was a masterpiece of simplicity, a 12-cylinder aluminum power plant capable of running on nearly any fuel. But it was also heavily restricted. Soviet engineers at the rear had installed a governor, a mechanical limiter that kept the engine from exceeding a specific RPM threshold. Officially, it was to prevent overheating, preserve bearings, and extend the engine's life. Unofficially, it was a leash, one that frustrated every tank crew who knew how much more the machine could give. Sokolov knew that beyond that limit lay danger, but he also knew that in the chaos of the front, engines didn't die of wear. They died of impact. Tanks didn't live long enough for maintenance schedules to matter, and yet, orders from Moscow forbade any alteration to the engine governor. Disobeying could mean charges of sabotage, even execution under Article 58 for damaging state property. He'd seen it happen. One mechanic from a neighboring regiment had tried to boost fuel injection for better acceleration during a retreat. His modification worked. The tank made it out. But when command found out, he vanished by morning. Officially, he was transferred. Unofficially, no one ever saw him again. Still, the war did not pause for fear. Each month, the Germans introduced a deadlier machine. Long-barreled Panzer foos, the dreaded tiger thrn, and whispers of a new monster, the Panther. Against them, the once proud T-34s struggled. Crews called their engines the lungs of the motherland, but even lungs can fail under strain. One bitter night, as snow drifted through the cracks in a barn-turned-workshop, Sokolov made his decision. His tank, number 2A-17, had barely enough power to climb a frozen embankment during the last skirmish. His commander, Lieutenant Orlov, cursed the lazy engine and demanded miracles. Sokolov knew where the miracle was buried, inside the governor housing. He dismantled the cover carefully, keeping his breath slow to avoid fogging his vision. He'd memorized the schematics years ago. With a simple adjustment, loosening the tension spring by a fraction, the V2 engine would be free to spin higher, breathe deeper, and produce nearly 15% more power. It was risky, even reckless. The extra heat could warp pistons, melt bearings, or seize the crankshaft. But if it worked, the tank would move like no T-34 had before. He worked through the night, his fingers numb, the faint glow of a kerosene lamp reflecting off steel. Each turn of the wrench echoed in the silent barn like a drumbeat of defiance. At dawn, when the crew returned, frost glistened on his uniform. The commander frowned. "What did you do to her, Viktor?" Sokolov didn't answer. He only nodded toward the ignition. The crew hesitated, then pressed the starter. The tank roared to life with a sound none of them had heard before. Deeper, sharper, angry. The idol shook the ground. Snow fell from the roof in clumps, as if the barn itself trembled. Sokolov's heart pounded. He knew he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. If command found out, he would be done, perhaps even shot. But the sound of that engine told him something no manual ever could. He had given the machine its freedom. The next day, Tank 217 went back to the front. The Germans were massing near Ostrogozhsk, their tigers prowling like steel predators across the open fields. For the Soviet crews, it would be another slaughter, unless speed could change the story. And in that moment, for one mechanic and one tank, the war of machines became something else entirely. A war of hearts, hands, and forbidden fire. To most soldiers, the Eastern Front was a vast graveyard of steel. Tanks did not survive long enough to earn names. Their crews barely had time to memorize their serial numbers. The men inside them lived minute to minute, by instinct, by luck, and by the strange intimacy that formed between man and machine. For Viktor Sokolov, that bond was personal. He knew every sound, every vibration of his T-34. When the modified engine roared beneath him, it was more than defiance. It was vindication. In the Red Army's mechanized corps, tank crews were family. They slept, fought, and bled together in the same confined hull. The mechanic's decision was not a matter of pride, but of survival. Each crew member understood the unspoken truth. The difference between life and death could be measured in seconds. The seconds it took to turn, retreat, or outflank a German tiger. Sokolov's crew learned quickly that their tank moved differently now. On flat ground, it accelerated with startling force. In mud, it climbed like a desperate beast. They called it the breathing tank, others noticed. When Tank 217 thundered past, snow spraying from its treads, men turned to watch. Some laughed in disbelief. Others muttered that it sounded like a factory turbine, too wild to last long. Tactically, those extra revolutions changed everything. Soviet tank doctrine relied heavily on mobility and numbers. Overwhelm the enemy before their heavier, slower tanks could establish firing lines. But German armor, with superior optics and range, often decimated Soviet formations before they closed the gap. The T-34's only advantage was its speed and ability to traverse broken terrain. Sokolov's illegal modification amplified that advantage beyond regulation. During short skirmishes near Ostrogozhsk, Tank 217 began to outperform expectations. Its crew used the newfound power to execute fast flanking maneuvers, hitting from the side or rear, then vanishing behind smoke. German spotters reported a T-34 moving abnormally fast, appearing and disappearing before a shot could land. Some believed it was a lighter model, others thought it was a new prototype. In reality, it was simply a forbidden idea made real. Inside the tank, the transformation was physical. The crew felt the vibrations stronger. The heat climbed faster. Every movement became sharper, rougher. They were pushing the machine, and themselves, to the edge. The mechanic listened to every groan of metal like a doctor monitoring a patient's heartbeat. He adjusted fuel flow mid-march, easing the throttle before the engine could overheat. His hands were always blackened with soot, his face lined with exhaustion, but the tank obeyed him. The psychological change was even more profound. For months, Soviet crews had feared the Tiger, that invincible machine whose 80mm cannon could tear through a T-34 like paper. But the first time Sokolov's tank darted around one, slipping past its gun's arc before the German could reload, fear began to shift. The crew started to believe the impossible, that the enemy's power was not absolute, and belief is contagious. Other crews began asking questions. How did Tank 217 climb the ridge so fast? Why did it sound different? Sokolov brushed off their curiosity, pretending it was just good maintenance. But whispers spread. Mechanics from nearby units began tinkering with their own engines, testing limits, adjusting fuel lines, loosening springs, always quietly, always after dark. To the officers, this kind of innovation was dangerous. The Red Army's strength came from discipline and standardization. But on the front lines, improvisation was survival. Field commanders, desperate for results, began turning a blind eye. They measured success not in compliance, but in the number of tanks that came back from battle. The tactical results spoke louder than orders. During one engagement near a frozen river crossing, Sokolov's tank spearheaded a counterattack to rescue a pinned infantry platoon. Normally, such a move would have been suicide. Tigers and anti-tank guns covered the approach. But Tank 217, using terrain and speed, zigzagged through the ice mist, closing the distance before the Germans could adjust. It wasn't invincibility. It was momentum, aggression, and precision born of faith in the machine. The crew returned shaken but alive. Their tank bore new scars, chipped armor, a shattered periscope. Yet the engine still throbbed with the same wild rhythm. The commander, Orlov, said nothing. But that night, he handed Sokolov a cigarette and muttered, "You've built a monster, comrade." In the months that followed, reports of unusually fast T-34s reached regimental headquarters. Some officers called for inspection. Others dismissed it as frontline exaggeration. Soviet bureaucracy often moved slower than the war itself, and so long as the results were victories, questions could wait. The human cost, however, remained. Every battle strained the machine further. Overheating became common. Coolant hissed from ruptured valves. Sokolov worked without rest, patching, adjusting, coaxing life from a dying heart. The crew knew that each sortie might be the last, but in that fragile balance between power and destruction, they found something rare on the Eastern Front: control. Tank 217 became a legend, whispered between supply depots and frozen trenches. A machine that defied rules and lived long enough to prove that sometimes survival required heresy. And somewhere between the clatter of treads and the crack of cannon fire, the Soviet way of war was beginning to change, not in factories or headquarters, but in the minds of the men who dared to think beyond the manual. The Soviet V-2 diesel engine was, by design, a triumph of practicality. Cast in aluminum alloy to save weight and run on whatever fuel the front could provide. Kerosene, diesel, even crude oil. It was engineered for endurance, not elegance. On paper, it produced 500 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute, but hidden within its structure was untapped potential. Limits imposed not by mechanics, but by command. The governor mechanism, installed on every factory-built T-34, was meant to protect the engine from overuse. It capped fuel delivery and throttle range, ensuring tanks could drive for long distances without catastrophic failures. In peacetime, it made sense. In war, it meant hesitation, the worst sin on the battlefield. When Sokolov loosened that governor spring, he did more than alter an engine. He redefined the rhythm of Soviet armor. The V-2 could now rev past its safe limit, pulling harder on the tracks, delivering bursts of speed that stunned German gunners. The tank could sprint out of ambush zones, climb steeper hills, and ram obstacles that would have stopped others cold. It wasn't a miracle of invention. It was an understanding of mechanical truth. Soviet industry, in its rush to mass produce, had built engines that were stronger than they dared admit. The frontline mechanics simply removed the fear. But power has a price. Every extra revolution brought strain. Metal grinding on metal, oil thinning under heat, bearings crying out for mercy. The engine wasn't designed to survive such abuse for long. Each sortie burned through its life expectancy. For Sokolov, every mission became a negotiation with destruction. He knew the math. What he gained in speed, he lost in longevity. It was a trade only those who lived under constant fire could accept. The field manuals condemned such practices as technological indiscipline. But among the crews, it became something else, a philosophy of defiance. Mechanics started to speak quietly of unlocked tanks. Crews from nearby units came under the pretense of borrowing parts, but lingered, curious. They watched Sokolov's hands work, the subtle twist of a bolt, the minute adjustment of a linkage. They memorized, learned, replicated. To Soviet command, this was dangerous thinking. The Red Army's strength rested on collective obedience. Any sign of personal initiative outside the chain of command was viewed with suspicion. Innovation was meant to flow downward, not rise from the mud of the front. And yet, the war had reached a stage where survival required exactly that. Ideas born in desperation, not design bureaus. Sokolov understood this tension. He didn't see himself as a rebel. To him, it was simple logic. An engine that can save lives should not be chained by fear. But in Stalin's army, logic was often secondary to loyalty. If his modification was discovered, his name could appear in a tribunal report before sunset. There was also a moral cost. Each time he adjusted the throttle past its safe limit, he risked not just his machine, but his crew. One failure, one piston crack, one fire could kill them all. The responsibility weighed on him. He slept in his tank, listening to the slow, cooling tick of the engine, wondering if it would hold through the next fight. And yet, beneath the anxiety lay a quiet pride. The men trusted him. Orlov, once skeptical, began defending Sokolov's decisions in front of officers. When a staff inspector visited to record maintenance reports, the lieutenant scribbled engine adjustment for cold weather performance instead of unauthorized modification. That small lie kept them alive. By the spring of 1943, as both armies prepared for the titanic clash at Kursk, word of overperforming tanks had reached regional command posts. Some engineers from the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, where T-34 engines were built, were quietly sent to investigate. They collected field reports describing improved acceleration, faster climbing speeds, and a curious growling resonance at high RPMs. Most were dismissed as anecdotal. Yet a few technicians noted in private memos that these tanks achieved up to 520, 540 horsepower output. proof that the limits could be safely raised under certain conditions. Unknowingly, Sokolov and men like him had opened a door that official Soviet engineering would later walk through. The redesigned T-34-85, introduced in 1944, incorporated revised governor settings and enhanced cooling systems, improvements born not from laboratories, but from the front's unrecorded heresies. Still, innovation came wrapped in silence. No medals were given for defying regulations. Mechanics like Sokolov remained nameless in official dispatches, their achievements buried beneath collective credit. They were the ghosts of progress, the invisible architects of victory. Morally, their defiance posed a question that lingered far beyond the war. When does obedience become a liability? In a system built on rigid control, was it treason to think or treason not to? For those in the mud, morality was measured not by ideology, but by survival. A commander's approval could not stop a Tiger shell. A regulation could not start a frozen engine. Only courage, ingenuity, and risk could. Sokolov's illegal act was not a rebellion against authority. It was a rebellion against impossibility, and as his engine thundered across the steppes, it spoke a truth that would outlive him. Sometimes, the smallest twist of a wrench can turn the course of a war. July 1943, Kursk salient, Central Front. The dawn came red over the endless wheat fields, burning through mist and diesel smoke. The ground trembled long before the first shells fell. To the men crouched inside their tanks, it felt like the earth itself was breathing war. This was no skirmish. It was the beginning of Operation Citadel, the largest armored confrontation in human history. More than 2,700 German tanks, Panzers, Tigers, and New Panthers rolled forward in coordinated waves. Against them, the Soviet Union had assembled an even greater steel wall. Thousands of T-34s, dug-in anti-tank guns, and miles of trenches. For months, Soviet intelligence had prepared for this attack. But no plan, no minefield, could stop the shock of that first German thrust. In the midst of it, Tank 217 idled among a column of 10th Tank Corps vehicles near Prokhorovka, its engine rumbling with a tone unlike any other. Inside, Sokolov wiped frost and oil from his gloves. The air smelled of grease and gunpowder. His commander, Lieutenant Orlov, leaned against the turret wall, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Neither spoke. They could already hear the Tigers. Deep, throaty engines pounding the horizon. The order came. Advance. Counterattack immediately. Sokolov's hand found the throttle. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then pushed it past regulation. The V2 engine screamed. The governor, long since defeated, let the beast off its leash. Tank 217 surged forward, treads biting into mud and crushed wheat. Around them, the air filled with the chaos of mechanized thunder, the shriek of shells, the crash of impact, the metallic wail of ricochets. Smoke rolled across the open field like a second sky. The first German Tiger appeared ahead, vast, angular, monstrous, its gun glinting like a spear of fire. Orlov barked a command. The T-34 swerved left, using its newfound acceleration to break from formation. German gunners adjusted, slow but methodical. The first shot roared, a near miss, earth exploding just meters away. Sokolov clenched his jaw. The tank bucked hard as he pushed through the cratered ground. Each gear shift felt like a punch to the ribs. The modified engine growled, threatening to tear itself apart. But the T-34 was moving too fast, darting like prey that refused to die. They closed to within 400 meters. Suicide range against a Tiger. Orlov fired. The shell struck the German's flank, sparking harmlessly off armor. The Tiger turned, its massive turret grinding with hydraulic patience. It was a duel of seconds. Sokolov swung wide, circling through smoke. The Tiger's gun tracked too slow. Its 57 tons of steel couldn't pivot fast enough. The T-34 darted behind a rise, disappearing from sight. Orlov shouted coordinates, and Sokolov cut the engine briefly, letting the tank's weight carry it down the slope in silence. Then, full throttle. The engine screamed back to life, bursting from cover. At 200 meters, Orlov fired again, a hit to the Tiger's side vents. Flames leapt skyward. The German machine shuddered, then stopped moving. No one cheered. Inside, the tank. The crew sat stunned, their ears ringing, their hearts pounding. They had seen the impossible. A T-34 had outmaneuvered and destroyed a Tiger at close range. Not through luck, but through speed. Through that forbidden modification, turning theory into survival. But victory on the Eastern Front was never clean. 2 more Tigers appeared on the flank, their guns tearing into Soviet lines. One shell hit near Tank 217, flipping a comrade's vehicle into a mound of flame. The crew inside never escaped. The concussion rattled Sokolov's bones. Orlov ordered, "Retreat." But the engine began to choke, overheating from the strain. The temperature gauge climbed into the red. Oil pressure faltered. Sokolov's heart raced faster than the RPMs. He knew the engine could seize at any moment. Still, he refused to stop. He slammed the hatch open slightly, letting freezing air rush in. The noise was deafening. A mechanical scream and a storm of artillery all at once. Tank 217 zigzagged through the burning wreckage, weaving between shattered machines and smoking craters. German shells chased them like thunderbolts. At last, the tank burst through a hedgerow and dropped into a shallow ravine. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking of hot metal and the ragged breathing of men who had survived their own miracle. Sokolov's hands trembled as he shut down the engine. Steam hissed from the vents, the scent of scorched oil thick in the air. He knew they had won only minutes, but minutes meant life. Outside, the battlefield burned. The once flat steppe was now a graveyard of armor. Tigers smoldering beside shattered T-34s, the air shimmering with heat and grief. Above it all, the rising sun turned the smoke blood red. Tank 217 sat hidden, engine cooling, its crew silent. Orlov finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "You see, Viktor, they bleed too." And in that simple truth, born of terror and defiance, the myth of German invincibility cracked. One forbidden bolt at a time. When the smoke of Prokhorovka finally thinned, the battlefield revealed its terrible arithmetic. More than 1,000 tanks lay ruined or burning across those rolling plains, Soviet and German alike. The largest armored clash in history had ended not with clarity, but with exhaustion. The German offensive was broken. Kursk was saved. But among the thousands of Soviet vehicles limping back for repair, one drew unusual attention. Tank 217, its hull scarred by shrapnel and its turret streaked with soot, arrived at a rear service depot near Belgorod 2 days later. The mechanics who received it paused. The smell alone was strange. Burnt oil mixed with something sharper, a tang of overstrained metal. When they lifted the engine hatch, they found what Sokolov had always feared. The modifications. Hand-filed, fuel lines, widened intake ports, and a bypassed governor were impossible to miss. One sergeant called for the senior engineer immediately. Another whispered that this was sabotage, or worse, espionage. By the time Sokolov was summoned to headquarters, word had already spread through the maintenance ranks. "The man who tuned a T-34 like a race car," one joked bitterly. Another spat, calling him reckless. The Red Army did not reward disobedience, even when it produced results. In a drafty office lined with maps and blueprints, Colonel Mikhail Kravchenko of the Armored Directorate waited. His uniform was immaculate. His face was carved with the lines of too many reports read under too little light. On the desk lay the dismantled carburetor of Tank 217, tagged, labeled, and photographed like a piece of evidence. "You overrode factory settings," Kravchenko began flatly. "You broke seal regulations, violated design protocols, and risked the destruction of state property." Sokolov stood rigid, boots muddy, hands trembling from cold and fatigue. "Yes, Comrade Colonel." "Why?" Sokolov hesitated. He thought of the field, of the tiger's shadow looming across the wheat, of the moment his engine's roar had saved his crew. Then he spoke quietly. "Because, sir, the manual wasn't written by the men who die in them." The colonel said nothing for a long time. The room filled only with the faint tick of a wall clock. Finally, he leaned back, eyes fixed on the small mechanical heart lying disassembled on his desk. Reports had already reached Moscow. Several officers at Kursk had noted a handful of T-34s that accelerated far beyond expected limits. "Modified illegally," one after-action report read. Another described excessive engine strain resulting in increased maneuverability. What the papers didn't say was that in at least 3 encounters, those same tanks had outflanked German Tigers and survived. It was a contradiction, a dangerous one. In Stalin's USSR, initiative could be seen as genius or treason, depending on who read the file. For days, no verdict came. Sokolov and his crew were reassigned to mechanical inspection duty. Silent exile. Their tank was stripped down to the bolts. Engineers documented every change, measuring airflow and power output. They ran tests, data sheets filling with numbers that didn't lie. The engine produced nearly 100 extra horsepower, enough to alter the T-34's acceleration curve dramatically. Then, unexpectedly, the colonel returned. He carried no guards, no formal orders, only a folder, thin, stamped with red ink. He dropped it onto Sokolov's workbench. "Your engine," Kravchenko said quietly, "has been sent to Nizhny Tagil for review." Sokolov blinked. "Review?" The colonel's expression was unreadable. "Comrade Malishev's ministry wants to understand how it performed under stress. They are calling it a field experiment." For the first time in weeks, Sokolov felt something close to breath. He realized what the colonel was doing, rewriting the story. What had been illegal modification was now practical innovation under combat conditions. In the Soviet Union, words could change fate as easily as bullets. Still, the cost was not small. His tank was reassigned to testing, his crew dispersed. The Red Army would learn from his work, but his name would not appear in any document. Weeks later, when production memos arrived at the Uralvagonzavod plant, certain design adjustments were quietly authorized. Improved fuel injection timing, reinforced pistons, minor governor recalibration, all officially credited to operational data collected after Kursk. Among mechanics, the rumor spread fast. "They're building them faster now," one said. Someone up top figured out how to make them breathe better. No one mentioned Sokolov, but every man who had fought at Kursk knew what those extra revolutions had meant. On a cold evening in late autumn, Sokolov stood outside the depot, listening to the test roar of a new T-34 idling in the yard. It had that same deep growl, the sound of a machine built just a little past its limit. He smiled faintly, though his heart was heavy. He had broken the rules, and the rules, quietly, had bent to follow him. Inside the command halls of Moscow, official communiqué would record the victory at Kursk as proof of Soviet strength, discipline, and design. They would never mention the mechanic who had risked execution to give one tank a few more breaths of power. But on the battlefield, where smoke met steel and seconds meant survival, men remembered. They remembered the tank that roared louder than any other, and the man who taught it how. And from that moment onward, Soviet engineers began to test their machines differently. Not just for endurance, but for potential. The idea had survived. Quietly. Illegally. Permanently. The fires of Kursk had ended, but the war of machines was evolving, shaped by those who dared to think beyond the manual. The Battle of Kursk did more than halt Hitler's last great Eastern offensive. It redefined the balance of mechanized warfare. For the first time since 1941, the Red Army had not just survived a German assault, it had shattered it. Yet beneath the triumphal reports and celebratory headlines lay quieter revolutions, mechanical, procedural, and human. Among the lessons catalogued by Soviet engineers after Kursk was one recurring pattern. Engine performance had been decisive. Across the steppe, crews reported that the fastest tanks survived more often. Maneuverability, not armor, had saved countless lives. The T-34's agility, always its greatest weapon, had reached a new significance when faced with German Tigers and Panthers. At the factories of Nizhny Tagil, Gorky, and Omsk, where production ran day and night under floodlights, teams began analyzing frontline feedback in detail. Reports spoke of engines that performed above expectations, exhibited non-standard acceleration, or maintained output under excessive heat. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but the implication was clear. Somewhere in the field, modifications were working. Officially, no single mechanic's name was attached. But in internal discussions, engineers like Alexander Morozov, chief designer of the T-34, and Ivan Trashutin, head of the engine bureau, began testing small adjustments based on these combat anomalies. They focused on the V-2 diesel, the heart of the Soviet tank force. It was powerful but temperamental, efficient yet fragile under overstrain. The challenge was how to draw more strength without sacrificing reliability. What emerged over the next months was a subtle evolution. New injection pumps, refined cylinder heads, and better lubrication flow, all lessons distilled from brutal frontline experience. By early 1944, the V-234 engine variant began rolling off assembly lines with higher tolerances and improved power output, a legal echo of what one mechanic had done illegally. The difference was small on paper, but in combat, it translated to faster acceleration, quicker turret positioning, and greater survivability in the field. In tactical doctrine, too, Kursk reshaped thinking. Soviet commanders, once bound to rigid formations, began emphasizing speed over symmetry. The principle of mobile shock, fast, concentrated thrusts of armor designed to exploit weak points, became central to every offensive that followed. It was the philosophy later perfected in the Operation Bagration offensive of 1944, when Soviet tank columns advanced hundreds of kilometers through German lines, overwhelming them through relentless momentum. The culture inside the Red Army's armored corps also began to shift, subtly but profoundly. The rigid discipline of early war years gave way to a growing respect for practical experience. Factory mechanics were no longer seen merely as laborers, but as part of a living system of wartime adaptation. The men who had risked punishment for ingenuity were, in effect, rewriting the boundaries of Soviet engineering doctrine. Still, these changes came wrapped in secrecy. The Soviet system thrived on control, and innovation from below threatened that control. So, official history credited collective advancement of socialist industry. not the unrecorded courage of individuals. Sokolov's modifications, though unnamed, were absorbed into this collective myth, stripped of rebellion, sanctified by results. In the archives of the People's Commissariat for Tank Industry, the technical notes from late 1943 show an unusual line: emphasis on engine response time in low gears. Combat feedback suggests improvement potential. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement he would ever receive. But for the soldiers who had fought at Kursk, no memo was needed. They had lived through the transformation firsthand. Tanks that moved differently, breathed differently, and, for the first time, felt alive beneath them. That winter, as the Red Army rolled westward toward the Dnieper, the sound of their advance had changed. The engines no longer groaned and struggled under their own weight. They roared with confidence, deep, steady, relentless. The war was turning, and in the rhythm of those engines lay the pulse of a nation, learning, adapting, and evolving, one illegal idea at a time. When the Battle of Kursk faded into history, so too did many of the men who fought it. Their stories were not erased, simply lost in the immensity of victory. For Viktor Sokolov, the mechanic whose hands had defied the rulebook, the months that followed were a quiet descent into anonymity. After the inspection of his tank and the discreet confiscation of his engine, Sokolov was reassigned to a rear-line maintenance brigade outside Kharkov. The order was polite but unmistakable. He was to apply his experience in regulated contexts. In Soviet language, that meant underwatch. His comrades were gone. Lieutenant Orlov had been reassigned to the 1st Guards Tank Army and would later fall in the Vistula campaign. Others were scattered across fronts stretching from Belarus to the Carpathians. Sokolov, meanwhile, spent his days surrounded by disassembled engines, his nights in a drafty barracks lined with tools, gears, and silence. He was neither punished nor praised, a man caught between guilt and accomplishment. Sometimes, at dusk, he would stand outside the workshop, listening to the throb of tank engines on the training fields. He could tell by ear which ones were built before Kursk and which after. The new ones ran smoother, stronger, his unspoken legacy humming beneath their armor. The depot commander, a grizzled veteran named Captain Rudenko, once asked him quietly over tea, "They say you broke the governor, Sokolov. That true?" Sokolov smiled faintly. "I just let it breathe, comrade captain." Rudenko nodded and said no more. In that single moment, between men who understood the difference between rules and survival, the truth was acknowledged and buried again. As 1944 turned to 1945, victory drew closer. Soviet tank columns thundered westward through Poland, then across the Oder. Each advance owed something to what had been learned in those desperate months after Kursk, not just from factories or generals, but from soldiers and mechanics who dared to push limits. When Berlin finally fell, the headlines proclaimed Stalin's triumph and the glory of Soviet design. The T-34 was celebrated as the weapon that won the war, its reliability and power unmatched. But in the photos of Red Square parades that followed, among the waves of steel and banners, there was no trace of the man who had tuned one to its breaking point. After the war, Sokolov returned to civilian work at a tractor plant in the Urals. The engines were smaller, the stakes humbler, but the habits never left him. He filed pistons by hand, tuned carburetors by ear, and treated every machine like a living thing. His colleagues called him the Whisperer, a man who could make an engine run smoother just by listening. None of them knew his wartime story, and he never told it. In 1953, when the archives of the Ministry of Defense began quietly declassifying technical reports, one line resurfaced: Experimental Engine Field Modification, Kursk Sector, July 1943. Performance exceptional. The attached photo showed a scorched cylinder head, marked with a small engraving. 217. No name, no unit, no credit. Only the evidence of what one pair of hands had done in defiance of regulation and in service of survival. Decades later, in the 1970s, when historians wrote about Soviet innovation, they often credited the collective genius of wartime engineers. Few suspected that behind those collective improvements lay unrecorded acts of mechanical rebellion. Soldiers in the mud, reimagining how machines could fight. If Sokolov was alive to read those accounts, no one knows. But somewhere, in a forgotten depot ledger or a misfiled engineering note, the trace of his work remains. Faint pencil marks, pressure readings, and a short line in red ink. Governor removed. Result, exceptional response. In that margin, the story of one man's quiet defiance endured. Not as legend, not as fiction, but as a whisper in the engine of history itself. The war had ended, but its machines still carried echoes of those who dared to question them. And through that hum of steel and fuel, Sokolov's legacy, uncredited, unseen, continued to move the Red Army forward. History remembers victories, but it rarely remembers the small hands that made them possible. It records the roar of the T-34, the thunder of Kursk, and the collapse of the Wehrmacht, yet it forgets the quiet moments when a mechanic leaned over an engine and decided not to follow the manual. The two-hour story of Viktor Sokolov is not one of rebellion against authority. It is a story about survival within it. He did not dream of glory or innovation. He simply refused to accept that limits defined by bureaucracy were limits that had to define life and death. In that refusal lay the fragile seed of progress, the kind born not in laboratories or design bureaus, but in muddy fields, under fire. The Soviet Union would emerge from the war industrially transformed. Its tanks, engines, and doctrines became the steel backbone of a superpower. Yet behind every technological leap was a shadow, uncredited, anonymous, human. Men like Sokolov did not write reports. They left fingerprints on wrenches, burn marks on engine covers, and the faint echo of ideas that could not be spoken aloud. The T-34 went on to fight in Korea, the Middle East, and Africa, decades after its original creators were gone. Each time one of those engines started, it carried within it the lessons of 1943, the courage to go faster, the instinct to adapt, the will to endure. Perhaps that is how true history moves, not in speeches or decrees, but in the small defiant gestures that ripple outward, shaping what follows. The illegal modification of one tank engine did not win the war, but it helped define what kind of nation would. And in that quiet intersection of discipline and defiance, we glimpse the deeper truth of every war machine ever built. That even within the coldest metal, there beats the human desire to survive and to do better, no matter the cost. In every engine, there's a story of courage, defiance, and survival. If this untold chapter of World War II moved you, subscribe for more true stories buried beneath the battlefields. And in the comments, tell us, do you believe one man's idea can change the course of a war?